In Chapter 4, we're going to discuss bloodstain analysis, but it's under the context of the bigger idea of how to investigate a crime scene and reconstruct a crime scene. So we begin on this section. Here we go. So when we discuss reconstruction, it may be obvious, but let's just kind of clarify what do we mean by reconstruction of a crime scene. So it's kind of trying to describe the likely series of events that happened during the crime. So as if you could be back there in time and you were watching the crime happen. So, and we accomplish this with a couple things. So we're going to evaluate the physical evidence that's left at the crime scene. When you arrive on the crime scene, obviously it's not the same as it was at the beginning of the crime scene, but there's enough clues left of when you arrive at the crime scene to try to figure out what could have happened. And very importantly, the statements from any eyewitnesses, from the victim, from the suspects, from the witnesses, that's going to give a lot of context. So when we talk about this, it's not a job of one person, but it's really a collaborative effort. And it's now going to be the law enforcement officers, the detectives, the ones who are arriving on the scene, who are helping collect the initial evidence, but also who are doing all the interviewing, who are, have the experience of and the knowledge and the background and putting all the detective work together. And then, of course, we have the evidence side of it. So the forensics analyst, the one who's looking at the evidence and determining what can the evidence tell us as a story. And sometimes there's a medical examiner, a pathologist who's evaluating if there's a corpse, trying to figure out from the body what kind of information we can have. And obviously, sometimes there needs to be some kind of specialty science called in if the evidence is of a particular kind that requires some additional analysis. The crime scene investigator is kind of in between law enforcement and scientist. It's the person who's going to be often on the scene. So generally, the law enforcement people are on the crime scene itself, and the analysts are the scientists are in a lab. This person has more science background than the typical law enforcement officer, and they're working at the crime scene, and they're doing analysis of tasks that have to be done at the crime scene. So, for instance, although this is not the topic of the chapter, one of the examples they give of how a crime scene investigator does this unique job of being a scientist and law enforcement is that if you were trying to reconstruct a bullet path, you can determine the position of the shooter by using a laser beam from the point of where the victim was shot or whatever was shot through any holes in windows, for instance, that bullet had to have traveled through that, and then going backwards and other details. So one example might be this, reconstructing from bullet evidence. And this, sometimes becomes pretty important in reconstructing a crime scene. So this is a typical thing that is done. If they know where the victim was shot, the position they were at, and then that's one point, and then they have a bullet hole going through a window or some other object, that's a second point. They can use those points to create a line using a laser and move it backwards to where was the shooter. And sometimes that can provide actual details.